Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is a very exciting Synthetic Anonymous 2.0 webinar, during which we will unpick fashion, fossil fuel addiction, and hear from experts from the global north on the root causes of the issue. While in a few weeks' time, we will host another panel with experts from the global south to speak about the scale of the devastating impact of oil-based fashion in the countries. As you may have seen last week in Davos, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres launched a strong attack on the world's leading oil companies, accusing them of knowingly putting the world on course for climate meltdown decades ago, and refusing even today to abandon a business model at odds with human survival. I quote, "This insanity belongs in science fiction, yet we know the ecosystem meltdown is cold, hard scientific fact." While a hard scientific fact is also today's knowledge that the fashion industry relies on the fossil fuel industry. We've been talking for many years about the fact that this is an all-spectrum industry, ranging from agriculture to communication, and as such is also one of the biggest polluters in terms of energy, transport, waste. And we now also have plenty of data about fashion plastic problems because our garments are made of plastic. They shed microfibers when we wash them, and the end of life is sadly not in a compost garden. But if this was not enough a green picture, today a new groundbreaking report by the Changing Markets Foundation reveals how fashion impact extends directly all the way back to the oil fields. In fact, the fashion industry is such a huge part of the fossil fuel economy, trapping us into soaring emissions for years to come, that is extraordinary that is not on the climate or political agenda, or that fashion is never discussed as part of the divestment strategy. So I look forward to hearing from the experts today, who through their work have helped unveil this big dystopian spiderweb and help us grasp the idea that even each one of us, as consumer, as they call us, might have divested our savings, for example, from oil, or swerved unnecessary plastic wrapping on the fruit and vegetables that we buy, or swapped our car for electric, or switched to renewable energy, or stopped flying. But the clothes in our closet and in our kids' closets mean that we remain inextricably linked to oil. So Urska, I would like to start with you, campaign manager at Changing Markets Foundation, the Dutch NGO that accelerates solutions to sustainability challenges by leveraging the power of markets and exposing irresponsible corporate behavior. Urska, you have been working across campaigns on fashion since 2017, and you are the best one to tell us, where did it all start?
Thank you for the introduction, Livia, and thank you to everyone that is joining our webinar today. I'll jump right into it and try to answer this question, and I will just share my PowerPoint presentation as well. Hopefully you can all see it. It's true what Livia was saying, that the real environmental and social cost of fashion can no longer be ignored. We now have an industry that is running on fossil fuels, is filled with greenwashing, and at the heart of all these lies fast fashion. But what many might not be aware is about the strong link between the increased use of fossil fuel-based materials, meaning synthetics, and the rise of fast fashion. And this is the phenomena that has really kicked off in the early 2000s. And just to show you this correlation better, I want to show you this graph. So this is a graph that represents the production of different fibers throughout decades. At the very bottom, you can see natural fibers. In green, for example, is cotton, and you can see that it has historically been the dominant fiber used in the textile industry up until 2000, when polyester overtook cotton as the most used fiber. And since that point on, you can see that the use of synthetics, especially polyester, has grown exponentially, while the use of natural fibers at the bottom has remained fairly stable. And not only that synthetics grew exponentially, it's also that the production of clothing in general doubled between 2000 and 2014. And this is why we have fast fashion today. Basically, the overproduction of low quality disposable clothing is only possible because most of what we wear today is made from fossil fuels. Synthetics already present 69% of all fiber production. And if the fashion industry continues down this trajectory in the next 7 years, basically till 2030, almost 2/3 of all textile produced will be made from fossil fuels. And this also translates to consumer trends because we're now buying more. We're buying more because it's cheaper, and it's cheaper because it's made of synthetics. So people are now buying 60% more clothes than 15 years ago, but are wearing them half as long. But as you can see from this graph, this is not out of necessity to have more clothing produced, as the sale of clothing is actually growing faster than the world GDP. So synthetics really are the driving force behind fast fashion. And they're not only problematic because of that, but also because they shed microplastics that are ending up in our environment, our bodies, and are posing serious health risks, something that will be explained in more detail in the next presentation. And also because they're made from fossil fuels. So they perpetuate fashion industry's reliance on fossil fuels in the midst of climate emergency. But still what we find is that the fashion brands are largely blind to the fact that this is a significant problem. So through our fossil fashion campaign, we have been now for 2 years in a row analyzing policies and strategies by fashion brands to move away from fossil fuel-based fibers. For our last report, Synthetic Anonymous 2.0, we have analyzed 55 of the world's biggest fashion brands. And what we found is that they show no signs to cut their synthetic use. You can see from this table, for example, that for some brands, fossil fuel-based materials already represent 2/3 of all of their products. And then on the right side, you see from those brands that basically disclosed volumes of their fibers to us, that sports brands and fast fashion brands not only use large amounts of synthetics, but similar amounts of synthetics with, for example, Nike and Inditex that own Zara and Bershka and so forth right there at the top. We have also found that 1/4 of fashion, 1/4 of fashion brands actually record higher use of synthetics. And just to say that we did not get response from all of the brands, so that percentage is likely much higher in reality. And from the 55 brands that we have analyzed, only one, you can see the green circle at the top left, landed in the front runners category. And that's Reformation, because it was the only brand that committed to phase out synthetics, starting by reducing all virgin and recycled synthetics to less than 1% in the next 3 years. But sadly, you can see the big red circle at the bottom, and these are all the brands that landed in the red zone for having no evident policies and no strategies about synthetic fibers. And that's 40% of all of the brands that we have researched. So this is quite a concerning number, given that apparently fashion has a persistent plastic problem. And it's also worrying that discussions about increased use of fossil fuel-based material is completely left out of brands' climate strategies and commitments. So it's obvious that it's something that won't be solved or addressed by brands' voluntary commitments, and we do need legislation to decouple fashion from fossil fuels, and in this way also tackle the fast fashion problem. So I will close at this point, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Urska. I mean, I remember when Synthetic Anonymous came out, it gave a really pretty grim picture to all of us and to the fashion industry. And I urge everyone to go and check it out and read the report. And George Harding-Rolls, who comes after you and is your colleague, is campaign manager at the Changing Markets Foundation and leads the organization's circular economy campaigns, as well as the latest project, greenwash.com. George, you're also a board member of the Conscious Advertising Network, and the Dress to Kill investigation, which Changing Market released and follows Synthetic Anonymous report, that's something that no one dared to do before, and trace garments directly to the oil fields, and also with direct link to Russia and the war. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Urska, for kind of laying out the issue with synthetics in the background to the campaign as well. And actually, this investigation is something that we kicked off at the beginning of the campaign in early 2021, and it took us all the way through to nearly 2023 to actually launch it. So first of all, we wanted to really understand the supply chain for polyester in particular. You know, we chose the biggest fiber by production volumes to trace the production all the way back to the oil well. To kind of bring, right?
You went on mute for a minute, so you may want to start that sentence again.
Weird. Sorry about that. Probably my tech abilities being tested here. So initially, yeah, that was really to bring home that we are actually wearing oil and gas, and that it comes from this particular oil well, it comes from this particular oil company. Through the process of the investigation, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine broke out. And what was happening at that time was all the sanctions that were being brought in against Russia, against Russian oil in particular, by the UK, by the EU, by the US, actually started to be very quickly undermined by increased imports, increased sales of discounted oil in countries like India and China. So we added into our investigation a specific focus on Russian oil to see if we could piece together these supply chains. And what we found was pretty controversial. It was pretty explosive, and really paints the entire industry in a very, very bad light, in that, you know, it's bad enough as it is with the reliance on oil, and even worse with this reliance on Russian oil. I'll just share my screen very quickly. Yes, there we go. How do I present? There we go. So yeah, we did this in partnership with Stand.Earth. We've got Rachel on the webinar with us, and then Zero Waste Alliance Ukraine, who were, well, not on the ground because the team were mostly not in Ukraine at that point, but provided really, really valuable kind of sense making of what was going on the Ukrainian level. It's not changing, is it? There we go. So these are the results. We picked two of the largest polyester producers in the world. So that's Reliance Industries in India, and Hongli Petrochemical in China. Both of these were picked because not only are they very large producers of polyester, but they are also vertically integrated companies, which just allows us to see that the oil going in one end is coming out the other end in polyester at the other end. So what we did is we reached out to these 55 brands as part of the Synthetics Anonymous research, and we asked them about their supply chains. We then took this information plus publicly available information from them, or from the Open Apparel Registry, the Open Supply Hub as it is now, along with our desk-based research, our customs data, investigations that our researchers were carrying out to confirm these supply chain links. And this is what emerged from it, was really a huge number of very, very well-known brands with tainted supply chain links to Russian oil. So it's Hongli and Reliance who are then buying discounted Russian crude during this period that sanctions have been leveled on Russia and on the Russian oil industry. So 39 out of the 55 brands were found with links to Russian oil, and 25 of these brands had actually ceased their downstream operations in Russia at the start of the war in Ukraine. So they had closed their shops. They were no longer selling to Russia, and a lot of them were making very, very public statements of the fact that they did not support what was going on. And yet, with one hand, they're saying that, and with the other, they are still implicated in these supply chains, directly or indirectly, with the Russian war. So we have the difference between these two kind of areas. You've got the yellow segment, that's direct links where Hungly or Reliance are on the supplier lists, are in the supply chains directly of these companies, of these fashion brands. And then the other circle is where we've managed to piece together this supply chain through additional research, through additional investigations, through middlemen companies, middlemen suppliers. So these range from Bangladesh, Turkey, India, Vietnam, all these garment manufacturers who are then sourcing from Reliance and Hungly and downstream to the fashion brands. An example of how we piece together the supply chain on Russian oil. So this is Jamnagar refinery up in the top corner. It's one of the world's largest oil refineries. It has it has the world's largest off-gas cracker. It has a slew of environmental and social problems to go with it, as well as being a massive site of petrochemical production. And we traced to exemplify what was going on with the supply chain. We traced shipments from Kosmino Port on the other side. Over here, Kosmino Port is at the end of the Trans-Russian oil pipeline, and that was sending shipments quite frequently down to the Jamnagar refinery. And then that is a big hub of petrochemical production, polyester production being one of them. So that was just the kind of to exemplify what's going on, to show these shipments in action. We also looked at, here we go, one of the questions in our survey outreach was to brands about coal. Now, most times the fashion brands are asked about coal, they're asked about coal-fired plants, whether they're coal-fired plants that are running their operations, particularly in wet processing. But actually, this was a slight trick question, because we'd already found in our investigation that Hungly, the Chinese polyester producer, has invested $20 billion in making polyester out of coal in operations that they plan to come online by 2025. So we asked these brands, many of whom are very vocal about not using coal in their supply chains, whether they would in future source from a supplier that is making polyester from coal. And as you can see, apart from the slightly strange responses from Lindex and Tesco's, who said they'd be quite happy with that, not sure. A lot of them were either hazy or said they would absolutely not be doing that. And yet there is a very real risk that if they continue their supply chain links to Hungly, then that will be wearing polyester made from coal in just a few years' time. So I think that really part of what we're showing here is not only this like really entrenched reliance on fossil fuels, and then the kind of other impacts that can have in terms of supporting petrostates, in terms of supporting pretty dodgy goings on the ground at the other end. Which countries are you supporting by supporting these fossil fuel companies? It's coal. It was also very unconventional fossil fuels such as fracked gas from Pennsylvania that was going into supply chains, as well as Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco is the world's #1 greenhouse gas emitter, one of the largest companies in the world. And that's feeding oil directly into the supply chains of these fashion brands. And yet at the other end, not only are they saying that they are not supporting Russia, but they're also making some very big green claims. And we're all aware of some of the ones on this list that have been hauled up for those green claims, but they continue to do so despite what's going on at the wellhead and despite this very, very dirty supply chain that they are involved in. Just checking that's the end of my slides. That is the end of my slides. So yeah, this is not the only way that fashion brands are reliant on fossil fuels, of course. And we've got Rachel, who's joining us. Holistically, fashion brands are entrenched in the fossil fuel industry. I think the side that people are less aware of is their reliance on fossil fuels for fiber. But there's also a hell of a lot going on in their wider reliance on fossil fuels. So I'll hand over to Rachel, who's the expert on that side.
I think before talking to Rachel, George, because what you've been talking about is pretty grim and scary, picture. Not only, the claim to we are all wearing oil and gas, and in the future we'll all be wearing coal, right? But maybe we should send your report to COP28 and make sure that it's on everyone's desk then. But the more obvious thing that, in the last couple of years we've been discussing is about plastic, right? Which is also the derivative of oil industry. And Evelien Davidson is the campaign manager at the Plastic Soup Foundation. The foundation aim is to stop the unnecessary plastic production at the source. So plastic soup has also been tackling the issue from the more commonly known problem. And Evelien current campaign focuses on closing the plastic tap, as she calls it, targeted towards the biggest polluters in the industry, influencing decision makers at EU Parliament. The research shows that almost 70% of our clothing, as Urska also said, is made of plastic. And what happens is, as Synthetic Anonymous report also proved, these clothes are being worn only 7 times on average. No? So the plastic pollution that they create is enormous. And Evelien, this is also the reason why you recently launched the plastic fashion campaign at the beginning of November last year. So tell us a little bit more about that before we delve into brand's commitment with Rachel.
Thank you very much, Livia. Yeah, so I will also share my screen briefly. Can you see it?
Yeah.
So as you already mentioned, we launched the plastic fashion campaign November last year, which focuses on the plastic pollution of fast fashion and the link to microplastic fiber release and what it does to the human health. We address the industry and that they should take responsibility for this problem. We also inform consumers about the effect of microplastic pollution, and we give them tools to make conscious choices. And finally, we inform and encourage policymakers to pass strict laws and force clothing industry to stop plastic pollution at the source. So, as Urska already mentioned in the report of Changing Markets, that the brands should do much more on microplastic pollution. And we launched a report on that shows all kinds of evidence on what the effects are of microplastics on the human health, with a focus on microplastic fibers. The numbers of publications is growing rapidly, and the first one was published in 2009, as you can see. And last year, nearly 380 were published, and more is known about the effects of microplastics to the human body. In 2019, Plastic Soup Foundation hosted the first ever Plastic Health Summit, and the connection between plastic and health was quite new at that time, but we were already asking ourselves, do plastics make us sick? And this year we are organizing the 3rd edition of the Plastic Health Summit. And experts around the world will present groundbreaking studies on how microplastics and nanoplastics behave in our body. Well, this graph is already shown by Urska. As you can see, microplastic, or the polyester is growing rapidly, so does the microplastics and microplastics fibers around us. And IUCN estimated in 2017 that 35% of the global release of primary microplastics in the oceans are coming from laundry of synthetic textiles. So it's in our water, it's in our food, but it's also around us in the air by the clothes we are wearing. So we also inhale microplastic fibers. And just to give you well, not so really fun fact, but if you put a plate of mussels for 30 minutes on a table in a restaurant, the result is that 2 to 3 times more microplastic fibers or microplastics will fall onto the plate than are inside the mussels. So what does it do to our health? The small particles are more easy to get its way to our organs and transport in our blood. So recent studies are looking into the effects on our brain. And microplastics are also found deeper into our lungs because of inhalation, and that can cause infections. Microplastics fibers can also cause chronic inflammation. This is known to cause cancer, heart disease, asthma, and diabetes. And it may also affect other organs like the liver, the kidney, and the brain. The main findings of our reports is that it might be a risk to our brain. A research with mice has shown that microplastic accumulate in the brain and it can contribute to Alzheimer's disease. And there is the pathogens and parasites can be a vehicle for to distribute diseases. in the environment. Another problem we see is that microplastic fibers from clothes can contain flame retardant, PFAS, to make it waterproof, and colorant. And those are hormone disruptors, and they can cause cancer. And last but not least, we are worried for young children. Babies younger than 6 months old are inhaling 2 times and ingest 12 times more microplastics than adults. Well, this is a bit of a difficult graph, but I just want to show it because it's from a recent study where they found microplastics in breast milk. And it shows also that it's found in placentas, meconium, and infant feces. And if you look at the colors, then, for example, the blue color is nylon. And in graph B, you can see that it's found in meconium. So that's the first poo. So it was transferred from the mother to the baby. I think I leave it here because the next is more the recommendations. So then I think, Livia.
We can talk about it when we talk about the solution. But thank you, Evelien, because your story was the last one of the full, that gave the full picture of the scale of the issue and how fashion brands are responsible. Now we know of, even the things that you have highlighted and the repercussions on our health and our children's health. And it's now the perfect time to hear from Rachel, because Rachel Kitchin, the fossil-free fashion campaigner at Stand.Earth, is an organization that delivers large-scale solutions to climate and environmental problems all over the world. And Rachel campaigns to raise the bar on corporate leadership on decarbonizing the fashion industry. And in the past year, we have seen an explosion in large companies announcing net zero commitments. So if you listen to the brands, we're all going to be fine. But until now, unfortunately, the net zero plans have been a wild west of promises, many from brands looking for a quick PR win, like we saw, and with a really no plan at all to transition off fossil fuels. Stand.Earth said during COP27 that the fashion industry has an extra large role to play in the decarbonization agenda. But so far its action have been a disappointing extra small. And in the analysis pre-COP, you find that 8 out of 10 of fashion biggest and most influential brands are still increasing their supply chain emissions. Only just a year after committing to slash the emission in half by 2030. And one case that, Rachel, you're going to talk about is like athleisure giant Lululemon, for example. Their emissions are heading in the complete opposite direction, jumping by more than 60% in the past year. So, Rachel, I'm sure you have a lot to add to this conversation and to show what is happening at a political and climate agenda.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, so I just kind of wanted to take this opportunity to broaden this out, because, as we've had fossil fuel derived fabrics, we've had all that plastics and like the enormous impact that they're having on our bodies, on the climate. But as George mentioned, fossil fuels are really deeply embedded throughout the value chain. And this image is kind of just a little look at how fossil fuels are there at every kind of step in the chain. And we've looked at kind of the fabric and the material production. And I really want to now kind of focus on manufacturing, where a huge amount of the emissions are embedded. So, the vast majority of manufacturing, as we know, takes place in countries in the global south, mostly in Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And during this stage, there are highly energy intensive processes going on, which right now are achieved using a combination of coal or other fossil fuels burned on site, and lots of electricity brought in from grid systems, which are still heavily fossil fuel dependent. So that means lots of emissions, lots of air pollution, both in communities that are already deeply impacted by climate change. And, yes, decarbonizing the manufacturing process is maybe not really like the sexy part of sustainability, but it is essential. If we just take carbon emissions as our vector, the World Resource Institute and AII did some really great research which found that transitioning fashion supply chains to renewable energy alone would cut the sector's emissions by around 27%. So we know that the industry, and in fact, every industry actually has to cut emissions in half by 2030 to keep that 1.5 dream alive. And fashion's impact is one of the biggest out there. So this is a huge piece of the puzzle. Stand's fossil-free fashion campaign, as Livia mentioned, it would be like we're working to kind of try and raise the bar on sector ambition, to try and identify brands that can be leaders in this space, leaders in this race to decarbonize. But you know, we also have a campaign which, if I can skip to the next slide, is focused on the Canadian athleisure brand Lululemon, who for us kind of encapsulates these issues. They are almost entirely using fossil fuel derived fabrics. We've already seen that in the Synthetics Anonymous report. Their manufacturing is largely based in Vietnam, Bangladesh, and they're extremely fast growing. And with that growth comes more energy demand, more emissions, unless they act now to decarbonize that. And as Livia mentioned, our little piece of research found that Lululemon's emissions were the fastest growing of all of the brands that we looked at. So yes, I mean, the good news, if you like, is that sector-wide ambition does seem to be going up. You know, we're seeing lots of examples of brand commitments coming in all the time. The Fashion Charter, which has more than 100 companies signed up now, raised its commitment level at COP26 a year or so ago. And yet, the fact remains that in most brands, emissions are not going down. In fact, they are still going up. So yes, we had a little piece of analysis out before COP27 last year, which is a full year after the new charter commitments. And we found that the vast majority of the brands, which were all charter members, were not just not going down, but were actually heading in the wrong direction. So I guess the question is, like, what is happening here? How can climate ambition be increasing at the same time as climate impact? And this is where, for us, the devil is really in the detail. We need a way to tell whose commitments are worth the time and space that they take up, and who's are more in line with Boohoo announcing a Kardashian sustainability ambassador. So we have help. At COP27, the UN's high-level expert group produced some really great guidance, which is very much actually in line with what we would like to see from brands. And I mean, for me, all commitments should be judged against this criteria. And I'm just going to pull out a few highlights that are important because there's quite a lot of them. One is offsets, none of them. Emissions reductions have to be absolute and not just kind of cancelled out by buying offsets, fancy accounting. The other is that we need to reach into the supply chain, all the way into the value chain with no exclusions. We know that 90% more of a brand's emissions are in the supply chain outside of their direct operations. So this piece is absolutely essential. And with it comes the energy transition. So that means brands need to be committing to renewable energy, not just in their own operations, but throughout their supply chain, and supporting and aiding that transition to help drive a renewable energy transition that extends beyond just the fashion sector. And they need to be transparent. They need to be setting baselines and reporting against those targets so that accusations of greenwashing don't fly. We need to be accountable and have the opportunity to hold brands accountable for their promises. So we took a little bit of a time to analyze a few of the existing commitments in the industry against these guidelines. We found some trends emerging, the biggest being that no one was really meeting these standards. this isn't, the most comprehensive research. We took like a little snapshot of 10 top brands. We found H&M and Kering kind of came close. This is just one section based on net zero ambition. But overall, some kind of key themes were that emissions targets were not reaching deep enough into the supply chain. We weren't seeing the same level of ambition in the supply chain as we need to see and as we were seeing in their own operations. And that's kind of a key potential space for greenwashing. We also found that renewable energy is almost entirely absent from supply chain commitments. And there's a large implementation gap when it comes to that fossil fuel phase out in the supply chain. And then we also found that a lot of brands are failing to provide that key supply chain transparency, essential, as I mentioned, for holding them accountable. So kind of just to leave you something positive, I think the theme here is that we are seeing movement, we're seeing growth and ambition, and we know where that ambition needs to take us. What we're looking for now is progress. So Stand.Earth also produces a scorecard, our fossil-free fashion scorecard, where we look closely at these decarbonisation issues, as well as the role that circularity has to play in that. Our next scorecard is coming out in March, where we will be doing a much deeper dive on where that implementation is at this point in time, who's kind of moving the dial in the right direction. So to keep a lookout for that too. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. I mean, it's absolutely true, as you showed us, every industry needs to cut emissions in half, but fashion is moving in the opposite direction, you said. And Urska reminded us that consumption of clothes has grown faster than population or GDP. So there is a lot of confusion, which is fueled by a lot of greenwashing that you're also being touched upon. George, one of your latest effort is the greenwashing.com. So maybe you are the best at giving us a quick picture of what is happening inside this great greenwashing machine.
Okay, well, you have to stop me because I can have a tendency to go on about greenwashing until the cow's gone home. So Synthetics Anonymous 1, which we did in the summer of 2021, reached out to around 50 fashion brands to find out about their synthetics policies. We also did some market research on 4,000 different products across 12 online brands to assess the level of synthetics they were using. And then also it was kind of a last minute thing, and I'm really glad we did it, to look at the green claims that they were making against their products. We assessed them against the Competition and Markets Authority's Green Claims Code, which at the time was still in its draft format, and found that 59% of those claims were misleading or unsubstantiated, which is actually quite a conservative estimate, because we had a very broad range of brands from luxury all the way through to fast fashion, and fast fashion were making a huge number of unsubstantiated claims. H&M still had their conscious collection, and that was all greenwashing. So that was in the kind of 90% level. And then given that the fashion, it was one of the worst, or is one of the worst for greenwashing, because it's so consumer facing, because Livia and I were chatting about this a while ago. Unlike other industries, there's a very easy way to opt out of the fashion industry, which is just like, don't buy new clothes. And so the fashion industry has to kind of convince us that buying new clothes is a way to save the planet, or is a way to reduce your impact, whether or not that's true. So to highlight this huge issue, we built a website called greenwash.com, which we launched outside London Fashion Week 2022, with me dressed as a washing machine to my
That was the highlight, yes.
And yeah, to really highlight this huge issue in the fashion industry. And we've since expanded greenwash.com out to plastics, and food will be coming later in this year. Greenwashing is really having its moment, including the crackdown on it. And part of the reason, I guess I'll sort of wrap it up here, part of the reason that greenwashing is so crucial to crack down on is we've all been talking here about like what a bad state the fashion industry is. Its emissions going in the wrong direction, its waste is going in the wrong direction, its reliance on fossil fuels wrong direction. Except if you listen to the fashion industry, you hear a completely different story. You hear that everything's getting better. There's this new circular line. There's this new collaboration they're doing here. They're reducing their carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And what's in the middle is this huge greenwashing smokescreen, and it misleads us. It most importantly, it misleads the policymakers who, if they're looking around for the solutions, will think it's fine. The fashion industry seem to have it under control. Let's look at a different industry, or let's lead them to it. And it misleads every single one of us to thinking that buying new clothes or buying better clothes is actually a way to help things. Remove the smokescreen and you suddenly see the emperor with no clothes on, and you realize that, oh my God, we've got to pull on some different levers. For us, that's legislation, particularly on greenwashing, but otherwise as well.
Thank you, George. We don't have a lot of time left, and I really want to leave some time for the Q&A. And by the way, thank you for each one of you that is starting to send the questions in the chat box. But can we quickly close on solutions? Because Rachel gave us already a vision of the guidance, that's the framework that has been set up during COP27. So Urska, George, Evelien, and Rachel, by all means, if you want to add like a fast, like solution-based comment, so that then we can move into the Q&A and start the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to follow up from George's comment and the fact that actually legislation is already taking place. So this era of self-regulation by the industry is coming to an end. I mean, we've just seen a new wave of legislation coming in France. As George mentioned, there's UK authorities that are already regulating green claims and tackling greenwashing. And, most notably, we have the EU, which is the biggest importer of textiles and apparel, that is currently preparing a range of legislation. And that is a huge opportunity for the sector as a whole, because they also recognized in their own textile strategy that, there is an obvious link between synthetics and fast fashion, microplastic pollution, and also unsustainable use of non-renewable resources. So it really represents a great opportunity. And a very interesting finding from our Synthetic Anonymous 2.0 report was that majority of brands actually express support for the upcoming legislation at the EU level. Majority said, yes, we would support end-of-life management, we would support a stricter regulation on greenwashing, on transparency, and so forth. So basically, even brands are signaling that it's time to go beyond voluntary measures, and that policymakers need to step up and start regulating the sector.
Thank you. Evelien?
Yeah.
A quick solution?
Yes.
There are quick solutions.
Solutions need to happen on 3 levels, as Urska said, on policy level. And we really also hope that the scientific evidence will be recognized, and also to set a maximum threshold on microplastic shedding, microplastic fiber shedding. And industry, of course, needs to move, but we also, as Plastic Soup Foundation, look at consumers, what they can do. And of course, you don't want to put the blame on the consumer, but you can actually make different choices, what you buy, how you wash it, or that you don't buy anything, how you take care of your clothes better. So it's available on our website if you are interested.
Thank you. George?
I'll be quick. Reduction in reliance on synthetics is incredibly important. What is new this year and what's exciting this year is, as Urska said, we've got Reformation, which is the first brand. So they're reducing their reliance on all synthetics down to less than 1% of sourcing by 2025, and of virgin synthetics by 2030. It's an incredibly important lever to pull. Obviously, all fibres do have issues, but synthetics in particular, and then fashion brands all around the world, whichever size, need to be seriously thinking about overproduction and how to create and unlock value in a way that doesn't create too many clothes.
Rachel, I don't know if you want to add more about, from the recommendation that you showed. I'm sure you have a lot to say still.
I do, but I will try and keep it brief. I think I agree with everything that's been said. I would love to see legislative solutions, particularly on transparency, because I think a level playing field is really what the sector absolutely needs. But again, just to kind of drive on this, that renewable energy and that fossil fuel phase out is absolutely essential. We need to be seeing significantly increased ambition and significantly increased timeline ambition as well. We need to see commitments to renewable energy in the supply chain by 2030, so that the sector can move together, because it is difficult for individual suppliers to make that transition, and that is a fact. But brands working together can help support and drive an energy transition which reaches beyond their own individual supply chains.